I want to welcome everyone. Thank you for joining us. My name is Holly Alfano. I'm the CEO of ILMA, and I'm here in the ILMA offices, the Independent Lubricant Manufacturers Association in Alexandria, Virginia, right outside of Washington, D.C. I want to welcome our 2020 president, Chuck Jagger. He is also president of American Oil. Chuck, thanks for joining us.
All right, thank you, Holly, and welcome everyone to the ILMA Town Hall number 2. We have a great program in store for today. We have a record level of participation. We have over 324 participants signed up for today's town hall meeting. I also want to thank Chevron Oronite for all the contributions they've been helping ILMA with all the town halls. Lastly, I want to thank the ILMA staff. For all you out there, you understand the amount of information that the ILMA staff has put out there over the last 3 months during the COVID-19 pandemic. Hey, Holly, how are things with the annual meeting?
The annual meeting is a go. We're very excited. We've got 400 attendees signed up so far, and our room block is more than a third, closing in on 40% full. So if you're interested in joining us in Boca Raton, October 24th through 27th, you might want to go to the ILMA website and register soon, because it looks like it's going to be a good meeting, and it's late October, so we're hoping that things will be much better in Florida by then. We also have another town hall coming up, town hall number 3, which is product updates, opportunities, and challenges. That's on October 5th. August 5th. And that session deals with transportation lubricants. So please join us for that. We have special guest panelists from API, General Motors, and Chevron Oronite. Registration information will be coming out soon. Now, about today's session. I want to just cover a couple of quick housekeeping items. You can submit questions by clicking on the Q&A icon on the bottom of your screen, and we will be taking questions from attendees. Now we're going to hear a perspective from IHS Markit. This firm actually recently completed a study for ILMA, focusing on the economic impact of our industry. Today's presentation will tee up the discussion for our panelists, and we'll explore how we must change to capture new value post-COVID. Chuck, can you tell us about our presenter, Suzan?
Sure will. Suzan Jagger is Vice President of Oil Markets, Midstream and Downstream in the IHS Markit New York office, and currently leads the Global Lubricants Consulting Practice. Her focus is on the development of growth strategies, competitive and financial benchmarking, evaluations of alternative business models, performance optimization, and transaction advisory work for multinational oil and chemical companies operating in some of the most challenging areas around the world. So I want to introduce Suzan, who is now going to present.
Thank you, Chuck. Thank you very much for the introduction, and let me share my screen, I hope, and we will begin the presentation. I never thought that the market of the USA would be a challenge to talk about, but we are faced with some unprecedented issues and concerns that a year ago, 2 years ago, we never thought we would be facing. I'm going to talk a bit about what some of those challenges are and how we have to change and adapt in order to continue to prosper in this business. First, if we look back at the beginning of this year, we were looking back at 2018, 19. Sure, we had challenges. We had a highly competitive market. We had a relatively flat demand growth in the marketplace. And we were also entering this transition of our entire energy industry. We were starting to embrace the growth of electric vehicles, of autonomous vehicles, and the commitment to zero carbon initiatives and renewables. And competitors all along the value chain of the business were beginning to ask a question that I never would have thought we'd ever ask of ourselves. Are we reaching a period of peak earnings? And when I talk about peak earnings, I'm not just talking about individual companies, but the entirety of the value chain, the whole pie, feeling as though we were starting to reach a peak. And if yes, if indeed we were reaching this peak, how were we going to be able to reinvest in the technologies and the products going forward to capture new value? Now, with the onset of COVID-19, the stage is set for players all along the value chain to consider how we could potentially consolidate to drive new efficiencies, drive costs out of our business to achieve and reach for new value. Now, as COVID-19 plays out, top of mind right now, as we're in the midst of this, is how to manage our supply chains. And most important, how we attain the most flexibility we can in order to cope with all of the challenges. We have an issue around raw material availability and the balancing act between the volatility and the demand that we have in the USA and maintaining production and stocking levels. As we move product across country boundaries or even within the United States, all the varying restrictions due to lockdowns and different restrictions that affect our business are creating challenges as well. And we always have had ongoing risks from product allocations, potentially having issues around having to allocate products, production caps, maybe some gaps in product availability, and formulation changes that we have to cope with. And all of these present potential risks going forward as we manage through this really tough time. The financial pressures inevitably will lead to a consolidation of blending and packaging facilities and distribution facilities as we try to manage our costs. But certainly we also need to think about moving to third-party relationships in all aspects of our business, manufacturing, distribution, and supply chain, in order to provide that flexibility that we need as we go through this. Now, what does this trend look like at this point? IHS Markit has been looking at these metrics almost on a monthly basis, every couple of weeks. Right now, what I'm presenting here is the current outlook based on all of the analysis we've done, the economic work, looking at the marketplace. The first slide here is the USA transport demand outlook, and we've actually shown not just the current trend, but also what we went through back in the 2008-2009 recession. So transport demand in this slide includes all of the automotive engine oil, driveline, aviation, and railroad products, excluding the international marine business. And what it shows currently, based on what we're looking at in terms of economic recovery, is that the average for 2020 in terms of transport demand is estimated to decline 25% relative to where we were on the average for 2019. So this is a significant drop. And actually, when we started looking at these figures at the early part during the first quarter of the year, we were looking at a more moderate decline. But as this has unfolded in the US, we are now looking at about a 25% decline relative to 2019. Now, as we come out of this through 2021, you can see a recovery spike in 2021, and then gradually the growth rates of the marketplace go back to a trend line that's more reflective of the other dynamics that were going in the marketplace before COVID. So if we look at 2022, we are still 9% below the level we were at in 2019. And post 2022, the trends in the transport market, those key trends that are driving future growth, include our outlook for new vehicle sales, growing EV penetration, and of course, extended drain intervals in transport sector because more synthetics coming into the marketplace as a greater percentage of the market mean that the transport demand remains below the 2019 levels going forward. So this is the outlook for the transport sector. Now let's look at non-transport or the industrial demand in US. This graph, the green line reflects the demand changes, the year-on-year demand changes. And the sector includes, the green line includes the industrial hydraulic, gear oil, turbine oil, compressor oil segments, machine lubricants, metalworking fluids, and other industrial oils. It's all one. And you can see it's very interesting compared to what we experienced back in 2008, 2009. It's a very different recovery, and of course it's being driven by very different conditions. So the current outlook for 2020 is that on average for 2020, the demand will be down by 17% on average relative to 2019. We see a much more gradual recovery in the industrial sector because of all of the changes that are occurring, the damage, and we'll discuss that in a minute. We don't really see a spike up, but we see the recovery extending through 2024 and never really achieving the 2019 levels going forward. Again, you know, when asked, why don't we return to 2019? On the left of this slide, we show a variety of factors that are impacting the destruction of demand. Some people refer to it as economic scarring. It's a horrible word. But the unemployment, the persistent unemployment, and the longer we are in this period, the more the unemployment moves from temporary unemployment to permanent unemployment as we see businesses shutter, bankruptcies, cost-cutting initiatives for companies to move to a more competitive cost base coming out of this, lost tax revenue and so forth. To the right, what we're anticipating is more of a clawing back. We're not looking at a snapback V in terms of economic recovery, but a gradual recovery through 2022. And many factors can affect this. And I'm sure that in the next few months, as we head toward the annual meeting of ILMA, hopefully we'll see some more positive news regarding that recovery. This is somewhat a moving target right now. There's a lot of uncertainty, but there are a variety of factors on the right that could affect that pace of recovery and could potentially change the picture. So what do we do today? Everything is on the table. Certainly, stronger financial players, and that in particular, the ILMA members have the opportunity to take market share in this environment. But right now, many of us are struggling to understand how do we manage the supply chain? What do we do in terms of, we have some choices. Do we outsource to third parties parts of our supply chain in an effort to move to a variable cost structure on the manufacturing and production side? Or do we insource our production and try to shorten up our raw material supply chains? We need to think more about expanding our digital-based systems to provide transparency at the interface with our customers so that we can identify areas across the US and across our market where there is faster recovery and growth. We need active monitoring of the supply chain to mitigate the volatility that we have to manage. And certainly one trend which we have been working on for many years now, and we've seen, is to consolidate our manufacturing around hubs, base oil hubs, to try to move the manufacturing as close as possible in an effort, again, to shorten up the supply chain across the industry as we respond to volatility in the marketplace. We may have supply chain gaps that emerge through process of rationalizing supply chains. We can lean on logistics companies and partner with them to try to bridge those gaps. And one surprise out of this is really becoming more comfortable with the virtual market. Look at us today. A year ago, would we ever have considered engaging across the industry, across so many areas, through a virtual means? And this will inevitably accelerate the internet sales, which have been moderately growing over time, but now as an industry, customers, market participants are becoming more comfortable in working through the virtual market. So thinking about what this means for independent marketers within the United States and Canada and even around the world, financially strong ILMAs with speed to market, with flexibility and being able to manage to lower costs, certainly have advantages to capture volume in a declining market that we're faced with right now in the immediate couple of years. And certainly relative to the less nimble, larger companies, the majors, national companies, regional dominant companies who aren't quite as nimble in terms of managing and being as flexible that the ILMA companies have shown to be over the years. So the bottom line here, yesterday's home runs don't win today's games. What worked yesterday is not going to work in the next couple of years. We are faced with some challenges, but for those who can move forward and take advantage of those opportunities, there are places to win, there are places to capture new value. So with that, I turn that back to you, Holly, and to answer any questions from the panel. I'm happy to, and look forward to, I'm sure, an interesting discussion with the panel. These issues are not easy, and our challenges are certainly significant right now. Thank you very much for the opportunity to talk with you this afternoon.
Thank you, Susan. Appreciate your perspective, and thanks for the presentation. We now have a number of panelists that we're going to be hearing from who are going to address some of the issues that Susan raised. Chuck, do you want to go ahead with the introductions?
Sure. Thank you, Holly and Susan. Great job. And we appreciate your time. We have three panelists that are representing three different segments of the industry. We have Greg Julian, who is for the independents. We have Colleen Smith, who is for base oil representative. And we have Kaustav Singh, who will be additive representative. And what I'm going to do here is I just want to read a few bios about our panelists so everybody understands who everybody are. So Colleen Smith is with Base Oils, and Colleen is Director Base Oils for Motiva. She started her career with Shell Oil within the fuel sales and marketing organization, and later continued her downstream journey through numerous roles within the retail fuels business. Along with working on marketing for Shell brand, Colleen led the marketing strategy launch of the 76 Fuels brand in the Motiva geography. During this time, she also served as board chairman for Motiva's TriStar joint venture in Tennessee. Colleen, welcome. Colleen, you are still muted, just so you know.
Thank you.
Yep, then guys, with this, there's always gonna be a few hiccups. The next panelist is Kaustav Singh. And obviously we mentioned earlier, he's gonna focus on additives. Kaustav is the sales manager, North America for Chevron Oronite, with over 10 years of technical and commercial experience. His background ranges from leading and building high performance global teams to R&D, project management, technology, product development, and commercialization, business development, portfolio management, and full P&L accountability. Welcome. And as you can see, I do have to read these because they're pretty thorough. Last but not least, of course, is he'll be focused on the independent manufacturer's view for COVID-19. Greg Julian is president of Advanced Lubrication Specialties, an ILMA board member. He's a past president and a chair of the ILMA Ethics Committee. Greg, welcome.
Thank you, Chuck.
I'm going to start the questions. I'm going to start with Colleen with Motiva. That was certainly, I'm sorry, I'm going to start with Greg. That was certainly a sobering presentation that we just heard. Do you agree with a delayed recovery for ILMA manufacturing members? And when do you feel we'll return to pre-COVID levels?
Well, unfortunately, I don't have a crystal ball. I think Suzan's crystal ball is probably the closest I've seen to some type of sense in this market. All that we can really react to is what we're seeing from an order standpoint. Just to put things in perspective, we went as low as about 40% of our normal order rate during COVID. We've recovered in the last 3 weeks to about 85 or 90% of our order volume. We're covering probably 5 of the biggest markets impacted by COVID, being Boston, New York, Philadelphia, Washington, and Baltimore. So we have seen a dramatic impact on our automotive business. And what we're primarily seeing there is not so much that primary cars or the main car in a household is driving less, because people are still trying to get around. But what we've seen a complete drop off on is what we would call the soccer parent syndrome, which is the second cars in households who tend to not be used at all now, because the kids aren't going to soccer practices or to any activities after school, or even to school for that matter. So with the fact that we expect most of New York, Boston, and Philadelphia to have stay-at-home orders for at least 25% of their workforce, at least through probably the end of this year, we're expecting the automotive segment to be dramatically impacted for us. I see it getting a little better at the beginning of next year, and then I would say by third quarter of next year, we should be back to what I would say pretty normal levels from the automotive perspective. If you look at the agricultural business that we participate in, that is still very strong. Our commercial sector is very strong, trucking. The industrial segment was impacted quite dramatically, but we're anticipating, particularly if we get infrastructure bills, and the administration still tends to be pro-manufacturing moving forward, particularly after the election, that business should be growing pretty significantly over the next year or so. So I would say we're still in the woods here through the rest of this year, beginning of next year. By the third quarter of next year, I would expect things to get a little bit more realistic to where we were in 19. Again, the automotive segment, it all depends on whether or not everybody's back to work. And a lot of these larger companies are going to allow their people to work from home or actually come back to work. So I'd say we're pretty optimistic, but it's going to be a tough next 6 months for sure.
Kaustav, what is your take on that question about returning to pre-COVID levels?
Yeah, before I start there, thanks Holly and Chuck.
Kaustav, okay, go ahead.
Can you hear me right now?
Yes.
Yeah, so first of all, I'd like to thank Holly for the opportunity. And also before I start, I'd like to say thank you to the ILMA community and everybody who's supporting this industry and on the front lines. Before I get into the recovery, I think it's important for us to kind of take a quick peek at how we entered in 2020. We had a decade of economic growth around the world, led by on the lubricant side and the additive side. Certainly Asia was on the front end. We had a flat market, as we saw from Suzan, for the Americas region, specifically North America. But when we look at the additive side of the business, there's a long development cycle. We came into 2020 with two major milestones, ILMA 2020 for the marine product line, and also GF6 and Dexos Gen 3 for automotive. So these product lines and these developments are long lasting. We spent a lot of time the last decade spending and putting in a lot of investment. And as we came into 2020 Q1, we didn't expect the COVID-19 to have this big demand drop. So as we came into, say, March part where the lockdown started to happen, the demand dropped pretty quickly at a pretty rapid pace. So the three questions that we started to ask ourselves is how do we operate with this demand drop and the collapse in the oil prices, manage the production targets safely and reliably. The second part was where do we see the bottom? And then the third part is where do we see the recovery and when will that recovery occur? So we looked at the recovery. Again, we don't have a crystal ball. We are looking at all the markers, as Greg said. We are cautiously optimistic. We divide the recovery into three phases: the short-term recovery, the mid-term recovery, and the longer term. So we believe the recent recovery that we saw in June in terms of orders and volumes, we are seeing some of the market indicators turning in the right direction. The orders and the volumes in April and May were almost 40% off of the previous month. So that was a huge drop off. And as we get into the short term, mid term, and the long term, we also look at all of the economic indicators. What is the best case scenario? What is the worst case scenario based on the government actions, based on the labor markets, and based on the consumer confidence. Where we see the biggest drop is the passenger car, automotive. We also see a big drop on the aviation because the aviation products have seen the largest drop in this COVID-19 phase. We saw a little bit drop on the commercial sector, on the automotive space, but the other sectors like ag and all has been pretty resilient. So all in all, we believe that 2020, we're expecting right now or forecasting around 80% target for the entire additive volume compared to 2019 levels. And as we switch to the midterm to longer term, we believe for the North American market, it will be approximately 2 to 3 years before we come back to 2019 levels. So right now our projections are for 2023 to come back to the 2019 levels, but it depends on a whole bunch of economic factors and more so the consumer confidence. What is important to understand for ILMA and some of the other folks is the volatility in the demand is pretty high right now for certain sectors, especially on the automotive side. But again, we are watching all the key indicators in the marketplace and try to assess our models and improve on our forecast as we proceed.
Thank you, Kaustav. I'm going to turn to Colleen with Motiva. This morning, LNG reported that U.S. base oil production in the U.S. was 13% lower than the 5-year running average for that month. It follows a similar decline in March. What indications do you see as signs of demand recovery within domestic base oils?
Yeah, thanks, Holly. So, yeah, I saw the same article this morning. So a lot of it is what I'll say is we're seeing some similar trends here with Greg shared and what Kaustav shared. I'm going to take a cautious approach too, as far as where we see recovery happening. So what Motiva saw was exactly what you described. So, you know, when COVID started kind of impacting us, we looked at, okay, where is the impact going to happen through our customer chain? So our biggest decline was in April and May, and the numbers are very similar to what I've just heard the other two panelists share with us. So that was truly a figuring out the demand impacts, and what happened within Motiva is it happened in different stages, and it happened with different at different rates with different customers. So similar to what Susan shared, is a lot of it is what happened in the industrial market. You know, any customers that we sell to in the PCMO business, that impact was happening greater than the non-transport business. And also just really getting a pulse from our customers in the quick lube business. I mean, those soccer parents, as Greg described, they're not out getting oil changes, even though some states might have been open for business, just no one's driving. So we definitely saw the impacts in those first 2 months. Again, similar to what we're seeing from the other two panelists, demand started to pick back up in June, a good month for Motiva, but then how do you sustain that is going to be our question. We're still cautious. I'm still cautious about, we're really in the early stages. I'm in Houston and I'm in Motiva's offices right now. There's 25% of us here, and there's not a lot of people on the road. So how long does this stay like this? And then what's the longer term impact? I will say too, from Motiva's perspective, we've had the ability, we sell globally, but also we're looking at what's happening in Mexico and South America. So as within the US, states and markets are in different various reopening and getting back to some type of demand uplift. What's happening in Mexico is in a different place than what's happening in various countries in South America. So that's something we're taking into account, is where can we move our barrels to get back up to meet the demand. As I look at where we'll be at year end, we're right in what the article mentioned. So we're about a 10 to 15% demand hit. By year end, I'm going into 21 with that same kind of lens of where our demand's going to be. So yeah, it's a pretty sobering number, but similar to what you're reading in the article today.
Thanks, Colleen. Question for Greg Julian. Greg, do you think that ILMA members' flexibility will benefit them as we recover from the pandemic?
Well, it really depends on the size of the ILMA company and what their supply chain is. I think the smaller ILMA companies certainly had a benefit because they may be getting orders and additives and base oils in by truck, which they could get very quickly. If you get to the larger ILMA members, a lot of us were stuck with 90 days worth of base oil and additive supply just as base oils were dropping. So it was a pretty dramatic hit for us to get through that and then finally replenish our stock. So I would say overall, the ILMA companies definitely have a benefit versus the major oil companies, but certainly the smaller ILMA companies can react a lot more quickly as demand starts picking up or as things start slowing off. So in general, yeah, I would say that the ILMAs would certainly benefit from this type of activity.
That's good news. Moving on back to Kaustav. Kaustav, you talked about some opportunities that may be out there. Which product lines have had volumes continue to stay strong throughout? In other words, where might there be opportunities?
So, Holly, as we came into Q2 or as the lockdown happened, certainly we saw the demand drop off in the aviation sector. So that's the hardest hit. As I said, the gasoline, the passenger car. And then comes less of a hit on the commercial side, heavy duty trucking, and certainly ag. Ag is another area where we have seen some resilience in the demand. We didn't see a drop there. Specialty chemicals, specialty units are smaller areas where we have seen continued demand. Power gen, natural gas type of applications where we have seen some strength in the demand profile. We do see some of those the automotive volumes coming back up in June. We'll see how sustainable they are as we go into Q3 and even in Q4. But I would say there are opportunities across all, not just products, but I would say products, processes, people, and portfolio. And what I mean by that is from a product standpoint, we are looking at new technologies. I think you talked about how do we not learn from this COVID-19, but how do we adapt as we come out of COVID-19. So we are continuing to invest in helping ILMA and our customers in differentiating their products as best as we can. We are trying to find new ways of marketing in this virtual market, in this virtual environment. We are looking at new technologies, whether it is trends around and alternatives around renewable natural gas, battery electric vehicles. What are the products that are going to be coming out of the COVID-19, and we'll see growth there. So that's on the product side. We see a lot of emphasis on sustainability. We feel that that will be a continued theme in differentiation. So we are trying to invest and help our customers to address that. And then I see a lot of improvement that Suzan touched upon and our other panelists too, is the process side. So from an additive perspective, some of the developments that we talked about or some of the specification that we are launching this year or the industry is putting together, GF6, Dexos, IMO 2020, especially in the automotive side, it's a long process. I mean, if you would recall, I mean, GF6 took more than 7 years, almost a decade worth of development. So I believe there are opportunities for us to look at those developments as we move into the future. How do we remove some of the unnecessary complexity from the process? Flexible, diversified, localized supply chains will be another area for all of us in the entire value chain to look at and to see how do we address that in COVID-19 and even going out of that. And adoption and adaptability of digital tools, that will be another area that we look at more and more as we go into these processes. We are all learning on the people side. That's another area that is going to be sped up from a people perspective. And finally, I would say all in all, the portfolio management. The more diversified, the more flexible portfolio we have, both on the product side as well as otherwise, it helps manage some of these crisis situations and also going forward. So as our CEO and chairman would say, winning in any environment to be able to design a portfolio like that. So right sizing our portfolio would be also an opportunity for us and for the market.
Thanks, Kaustav. You know, I'm going to turn back to Colleen. You mentioned, Colleen, that you're in your office and, you know, that 25% of Motiva's employees are back at work. What processes did Motiva employ to provide continuity between your customers and team during the lockdown?
Yeah, so I probably think a lot of people are relating to this, but you know, you lay out a plan. In fact, the June ILMA Compoundings magazine, the Ready for Anything, really resonated with me, because that's one thing that you plan for it and you think, you know, everyone in their roles knows what to do when a crisis hits and how do you pivot and how are you flexible. And then you get something like a COVID that hits you. And that can definitely test us all as everyone goes to work from home and making sure IT systems work and you have connectivity and people balancing personal lives. It's been a challenge, but we've been able to show that we can work through it, and flexibility has been key for us. What I'll say is, you know, when we tested any business continuity plan, is like, are you aligned as individuals, and do we have actual plans that meet our customers' needs, and whatever the market impact. So a great analogy that I would reference is, you know, being here in the Gulf Coast with our one refinery in Port Arthur, you know, every year we've got a business continuity plan that focuses around a hurricane. So it's all hands on deck. A hurricane you can see that hurricane coming, you can start prepare and start strategizing supply options and prep ahead of time. But when you got what, you know, I'll take the word from my boss, is a global hurricane where everything's impacted at the same time. And it's not just unique to one marketplace, but you've got coast to coast and global impacts all at the same moment. How do you really address that? And it's been challenging. A lot of it is just working with our customers. I mean, many of you on the call here, and I would say us reaching out to you to say, first of all, how are you and how is your company? How are you back to manufacturing? What's the look like? What's your customer chain going through? Sales cycle, Greg talked about inventory builds. I mean, all of this had impacts into us as far as how do we address that. So first and foremost, it was assessing how we are, but then also finding out from our customers, their impacts. And then again, like I mentioned earlier, a lot of it was different markets at different times, different segments were impacted differently. So we had to really pivot and shift as far as where our plans needed to go from production to supply logistics. And it's still changing to this day. I'll say too, what we also employed is starting thinking about, all right, so if production slowdowns are an option for us, what do we look at from storage opportunities? You know, so we had a team go out, and probably many of you on the call did the same thing too. Like, where are you still looking at to increase some of your storage footprints? And does that make sense now? And does it make sense for the longer term as working capital is definitely a play into those decisions? So a lot of it is just the open dialogue, the understanding what's happening with your customers in the marketplace. How does that impact us as a manufacturer? And then what can we do best to make sure we've done everything we can to minimize disruption in a very disrupted marketplace? So a lot of moving parts that have come into place.
You know, you're talking about a global hurricane. I think that's a really good analogy. How did Motiva balance the base oil supply requirements with other refinery sectors at the beginning stages of demand collapse? How did you manage that?
Yeah, so a lot of it goes back to, you know, Motiva's got a one Motiva value where it's, you know, we're all working together towards a common goal. So, you know, as the largest refinery in North America, and base oil is a sizable part of the North American business, I mean, truly sitting down and having the conversations with our colleagues. So, I mean, from day one, from COVID impacts, you know, having business continuity calls every afternoon was a call. And it was, you know, I can't count how many calls we would have in one day just leading up to a BCP call. So when we sat at the table, we can truly say, here's the position from base oil, here's the demand hit. And next to us on the virtual call, I mean, you're talking a big amount of people on the call, were our colleagues from the refinery side, the crude side, the traders, our distribution channels, to the fuel sales meeting. And we would have an hour assessment. And then out of that call, we would determine, you know, our leadership team would determine, all right, what levers need to be pulled or pushed in order to balance on the manufacturing side. So daily calls to get that seat at the table, that level of discussion was going on. What's interesting too is, since we do have retail in our chain, we have access to fuels reports. We can see credit card data from those gas stations that we have throughout the eastern half of the US. And kind of like similar to Suzan's content, is what we could see is by state, by market, where are the credit card sales for the gasoline volumes coinciding, and then looking week on week. And then what we would do is sit back and say, okay, so how are these fuel sales impacting in DC versus Houston? And then what do we see trending against our lubricant from what we're hearing from our customers? So she had the one graph just showing a bit of fuels and lubricant coinciding. So we were able to kind of take some of that data and then start to speculate what's going to happen. But a lot of it, Holly, was just us being over communication, talking, understanding the marketplaces, and us relaying back to the refining side of the arm, and just figuring out, okay, so what's going to be the impact based off the demand. And I'd say it was a good day when we said, okay, we don't need them daily. We still have them, but it was a lot of communication throughout the time being.
You know, I got a question that I'm just going to throw out there to everyone. If someone wants to, this is from one of our participants. What does supply chain flexibility look like? Who would like to take a stab at answering that question?
Maybe I can start there. So when we talk about supply chain flexibility, it's really trying to, I think Colleen mentioned that when these type of situations happen, is trying to understand the value chain internally, value chain externally. How do our different functions fit in, and how do we fit in across the entire value chain? So if you look at the last decade of growth, a lot of work has gone on into cost reduction, so Lean Sigma processes, so on and so forth. However, in COVID-19, when we talk about value chain flexibility, we are looking at how flexible our products are to meet some of these alternatives and meet the specifications. So as we looked at automotive GF6, right, there are pretty strict rule book. API came out and said, we'll probably give you help you out with some guidelines there. So really looking at the flexibility around the base oil coverage, the viscosity grade coverage, so that we can provide that additional flexibility to our customers. Also, raw material sourcing, right? We talk about BCP, as Colleen mentioned too. How are your products sourced? Do we have dual source suppliers? Do you have BCP with single source? And how localized are they versus geographically dispersed? So those are some of the things that I think we need to revisit in context to COVID-19 and even different crisis situations. Because we being in Houston, our plant being in Oak Point, we certainly have a pretty robust hurricane preparation plan, BCP plan. But in this type of situation, we have access to, in our company as a part of Chevron, we have pandemic response team, which looks at the pandemic. How do we respond to that? We have regional crisis team. So we have layers of information that we collect and then try to really feed into our supply chain and our functions, and also all the customer data sets, all the data sets from procurement, and try to really understand where how much flexibility can we build in.
It's good answer. Susan, did you want to chime in on that?
No, just to add to it, which it's about moving with the marketplace and having the level of volatility coming out of this recovery. Having variable cost structure that's the lever we have. To the extent that we can control our cost structure and be variable and be able to adjust it. So again, it's the challenge to have that flexibility. You have to look at whether you can fully utilize the assets that you have, the production assets, supply chain assets, manufacturing assets. And if you can't, you have a fixed cost structure, it just doesn't enable you to take advantage of the opportunities that may come. So I think what we're faced with is we need assets where the business is. We need assets where the business is, and we need flexibility of our cost structure. We need to be able to adapt because we are entering a period of unknowns. But those are the things that we have to work with. We just need to focus for the assets we have. And unfortunately, you heard, Colleen talk about the refining industry. It's one thing to cut back on a shift at a blending and packaging facility. It's another thing to dial back on a base oil plant and make all the refining economics work out. We're talking about a completely different beast. So the challenges on the base oil side are huge compared to, we can be quite adaptable, much more adaptable on the manufacturing and our end of the supply chain in terms of marketing and distribution. But a real challenge is on the refining side of how do you make those, because base oil is not in isolation. The base oil manufacturing is not in isolation from the chemicals and fuels refining. So that's a much more complex thing to get right versus us. We can find our way.
Thank you.
That's my perspective.
Thanks. I'm going to turn back to Greg. Greg, we saw some information about peak earnings and during the presentation. Do you feel that the industry has reached a period of peak earnings?
Well, it's kind of interesting. When we look at the industry, we look in three buckets: the manufacturing members, the additive suppliers, and the base oil suppliers. And the general rule of thumb is over a 10-year period, everybody's got to make some money 3 of those years. And really what drives that are two things. Number one is understanding the supply chain to make sure that you get the right supply chain consistency in the industry. And the second thing is the demand outlook, how strong demand is. So typically we've been living in a flat type demand market. So we've always been putting pressure on the three of us to try to make things work within that flat market. I think in 2019 and the first couple months of 2020, it was a perfect, beautiful storm for most of the industry. Demand was strong across every single segment. So most people, instead of beating up suppliers for better pricing, they were spending on trying to figure out how to meet the demand that is at their facility. And then when you look down at both the additive and the base oil folks, their supply was pretty balanced or a little tight. And when everybody's a little balanced or a little tight and demand is strong, generally speaking, the industry does very, very well. So I think that was exactly what happened in 2019. And we were certainly moving in that way in the early part of 2020. So I have to agree with Susan that may be probably one of the best years the industry is going to have or has had probably in the last 20 that I've been involved.
Okay. Back to Kaustav, are you, question for you real quick, what are you seeing in terms of actual additive demand activity looking in the second and third quarter? We heard some views, Greg in particular, express more optimism. What do you see on that?
So what we would say is we're cautiously optimistic. So as I said, April and May has been the two hardest months where we saw volumes drop 40%. We believe, based on our analysis and the metrics right now that we have, that we probably, those are the two months where we have hit the bottom. June recovery looks pretty promising. However, it has not reached back to what we would like to see. Going into Q3, we are watching how much of that is we will be able to sustain, or the industry is able to sustain. So that will be a watch point. And also as we go into Q4, as we open up, as the economy opens up, we'll see an uptick in the cases. We believe that we may not go into the lockdown that we had in April and May timeframe, but we'll also be approaching the flu season. So so those are some of the things that we'll have to keep an eye on as we go into Q3 and Q4. But at the same time, there are some pockets that still we see some recovery, like in the rise of e-commerce through COVID-19 that will hopefully continue on, and we'll see some growth in the commercial automotive sector. But the one that needs to be watched or where we have the highest volatility is the personal mobility. That is the passenger car.
Right. Okay, thank you. Back to Greg. Greg, there's been an ongoing consolidation in the industry that's in the last few years. Do you think the pandemic is going to promote consolidation among ILMA manufacturing members?
Well, I can tell you the pandemic has certainly had a lot of pressure on a lot of people's balance sheets. So I would say the weaker or companies that may have invested a lot in terms of capital projects over the last couple of years are probably seeing more of an effect than they would those of us who tend to have a little stronger balance sheets. But I think their big concern that most companies have had is the mental aspect on both the owners and the employees. It's been quite challenging trying to handle different folks having different working conditions than they're used to. So I could see potentially some owners saying it's not worth it anymore. It's time that I want to get out, because mentally it's been pretty demanding on a lot of people. So I would say there's certainly going to be some opportunities out there. But I can tell you, as an ILMA manufacturing member, no matter how bad the balance sheet is, they tend to survive. So they know how to make quick adjustments to make sure that they can work themselves through it. And we've been through some challenging times over the years. So I would say that the pandemic isn't going to drive it, but maybe the mental stress that they've had, or the fact that they just don't want to weather another storm like this could drive more folks out of it.
Okay, thanks, Greg. I'm going to pose a couple of questions. If everyone could turn their video and audio back on. I'm just going to throw these out to the panel. We got a couple questions from the participants. Does the panel see any recovery effect caused by the November elections? That's a really kind of controversial question. So, if someone wants to tackle that one, a couple of you want to chime in on that. I'd like to hear everyone's thoughts on that. Greg, I see you kind of smiling there. What are your thoughts?
Well, my thoughts are, if you look at what happened in 2019 and beginning of 20, obviously some of the efforts that the administration was doing in terms of promoting manufacturing jobs in the U.S. and bringing a lot of these jobs back, certainly, and consumer sentiment and all that, GDP growth. I mean, you can't really fault the administration for trying to help out manufacturing in the U.S. So I would say the election certainly could have an impact. Regulations, there's a lot of things on the table right now that our industry is very dependent upon, that if they become more restrictive will certainly slow the growth from our perspective.
Anyone else want to comment on that?
I mean, I can add. I think Greg, the last comment from Greg hit the home run. I mean, our products and our technologies we provide, basic tools to the society. I mean, energy, transportation, lubricants, all of those are basic tools. People don't see that up front, but it's there. So irrespective of what happens in November elections, I think our industry is essential, and we will continue to serve. We've been serving for over multiple decades and centuries, so it will continue in some shape and form. I think areas where if we see more activity in terms of construction infrastructure, that will have certain pockets and sectors that probably will see growth. But overall, I think irrespective of what happens, we will continue.
Anyone else?
Well, I think one factor, if I look at all the different economic scenarios that we've played out at IHS, one factor that would have an impact on the U.S. is trade policy. And if we can mend some of our trade relationships around the world going forward, and in a more cooperative manner, that does have an economic impact, which of course would have an impact on the U.S. So however that comes, certainly having less mitigating the trade wars and coming to resolution on that would be beneficial. And that would certainly could be affected by the election.
Sure. That's a good point. I'm going to throw this out to the whole group. What long-term effects do you anticipate from COVID-19 and having an impact on how we do business? Kaustav, you want to tackle that one?
Yeah, I can start. I think what would be interesting to see is when we come out of this, how much of it is temporary and how much of it is permanent, and especially around consumer confidence and the consumption patterns, how those two change as we it certainly has changed as we got into COVID-19, and how when we come out of this, how does that impact parts of the economy and our sectors. So certainly areas, for example, world economy, we do see progression towards higher automation. We talked about supply chain, flexibility, diversification, regional aspects. We certainly see consumers more savings. We're getting into a world of low interest rate, more savings, and certainly the rise of e-commerce that probably would have an impact on our, say, commercial vehicle sector. Business models, we can look at rise of touchless economy and also how we do work in our industry. That could probably be an area where we'll be revisiting or we might learn. And certainly the biggest one that I'm watching out, where we saw the biggest volatility and will continue to see, is the personal mobility. It's not just the near term, but the longer term. We are looking at congestion traffic, consumer miles driven all across the world. So when I look at data set in say Shanghai or Beijing, people who were used to traveling in transit systems, they are now getting away from the transit system. Ride sharing business models that where developed in the last decade. People are shying away from that. So all of those patterns needs to be looked at as we come out of COVID-19. Adoption of new technologies, whether it's electric vehicles or battery electric. Those are some of the technology changes that we have to see. Renewable natural gas, what the role does that play in the transportation industry in North America? So I think some of those are the indicators that we continue to watch, but personal mobility is the one specifically that I believe we are keeping an eye on.
Yeah, I'll just add, aside from just the marketplace and the impacts and forecasting, what is the world going to look like from consumer demand and all of that Kaustav just detailed. What I would say too, I think what's going to be interesting is seeing the impacts, the people side. You asked me, Holly, about the workforce. So how do we work? How do companies work when you're working remotely? And also, how do we interact with customers? So, we haven't been able to have a face-to-face with a customer since, some of us attended another conference in February. So, how do you sustain customer relations and do business in a remote environment where you don't have that face-to-face? And on the first part that I mentioned, how do we as a workforce work together? And also, we're on a bunch of international calls that we're taking calls at all times of day. So how does that sustain, and how do you keep business continuity going when you are in a work environment? I did hear too on a separate note that as more people decide to take, not to take mass transit, work from home, what is that going to do on a tangent? But what does that do to the real estate market? Major cities that have a big workforce downtown, what's the longer term impact on that? So I think that's just going to be really interesting to see how that changes our day-to-day work environments.
Colleen, we're having a boom up here in 2 hours outside of New York City as all of the New Yorkers have evacuated. Our housing values are climbing quickly. We've gained 10,000 people in the last couple of months in Litchfield County, Connecticut. And we're just curious to see how many of them go back to New York when it opens. Although I think they might miss their restaurants and their entertainment. Up here, it's a little bit quiet, but we're seeing this evacuation of cities into the suburbs, and we're seeing a real estate boom in the suburbs. So it's, the big question is how many of us are going to go back to offices?
Yeah,
we're debating that. I can tell you, even at IHS Markit, we have offices all over the world. We have a big office in downtown New York. We've got an office in Houston. And right now we're trying to figure out, how many seats are we going to need in the office? Are we going to be collapsing our offices and operating more virtually? But then I don't know about you folks online, but I'm getting kind of tired of the long hours in front of the screen. I want to see some people, we are social beings. We need that. And I think our working hours have expanded because we're not commuting. We're in front of the screen and we're working longer hours, having to cope with these emergencies and trying to figure out it's how much longer can we sustain this as workers? That's the point you made, and I'm with you. I don't know about you, but I could use a nice long vacation in Europe, but they're not going to let us go to Europe. So, right?
Holly, I'll just add one other thing. My concern is going to be finding qualified people to work in manufacturing jobs, particularly when they've been out of work for a period of time and there are opportunities for working at home. It's going to be harder and harder for us to find particularly younger folks that have an interest in getting into manufacturing type jobs. And particularly if we start picking up and get back to 2019 levels, we were struggling then to find qualified workers. So it's even going to be more challenging, I think, the second time around.
That's a great point. Well, I just want to thank everyone who participated today, and let's turn it back over to Chuck so we can wrap this up.
Yeah. Thank you, Holly. And same thing's happening here on the Jersey Shore. I've never seen so many New York City license plates that I have this year so far. I'm about 15 miles outside of the New York City south as the crow flies. So you can imagine what's happening. Houses are going here and people aren't even coming to look at them. They're putting bids within hours on them just by pictures. So it's going to be crazy. Well, to end this, I want to thank everyone, our panelists, Susan and Holly. I want to thank the ILMA board over the last 3 months. We've had many calls. The E-committee are getting together and working through this. ILMA's going to come out on top, as it always done. Greg was there for 2011, 2009 on the board, and I meant 2001, 9/11, and we got through it then. The ILMA staff, again, I can't reiterate enough what they've done. They've done a great job working remotely for our ILMA members. And our ILMA members too, which Greg mentioned, the 3 buckets, you know, that's our group. Like, even though we have our manufacturing members, we're all together in this whole thing. Last but not least, please put August 5th down on your calendar. That will be our next town hall. It will have product updates, opportunities, and challenges. And Holly and the staff are putting the program together. So thank you guys all for being part of it. And the fact that we had almost 300 or so attendees, it tells you something. People want information. And thank you guys for being honest and putting the right information out there. Holly?
Everybody. We're going to sign off. See you next time.
Thank you.
Thank you.